The night was thick with silence, the kind that only an ancient palace like Palazzo Rucellai could hold. The moon cast eerie shadows through the narrow windows, and the air was heavy with whispers of the past. In one of the grand halls, a young woman stood at the edge of a balcony, her eyes fixed on the courtyard below. Her name was Bianca, and she was a Rucellai, a daughter of one of Florence's most illustrious families. But tonight, she felt more like a prisoner in a gilded cage. Bianca's heart pounded as she clutched the balcony's cold stone railing. She had always known her fate, an arranged marriage to a man she did not love, a man who would take her away from this place she called home. But tonight, the weight of that future pressed down on her like a heavy shroud. She could no longer bear the thought of a life bound by duty and obligation, a life without choice. As she stood there, a gust of wind lifted the hem of her white gown, and for a moment she felt free. Free from the expectations of her family, free from the chains of tradition. But the moment was fleeting, and the weight of her decision settled back on her shoulders. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and stepped forward. The fall was swift and silent, a final embrace of the night. When she hit the courtyard below, the sound was a muted thud, lost in the echo of the palace walls. By morning, the courtyard would be cleaned, the evidence of her choice erased, but the memory would linger, a ghost that haunted the halls of Palazzo Rucellai for generations to come. Years later, as I prepared to sit for my portrait in a small studio in Florence, the story of Bianca Rucellai was never far from my mind. The marchese, a distant relative of Bianca, had commissioned the painting, a gesture that seemed both curious and unsettling. Why would he want a portrait of a professor, an American no less, in his palace filled with the ghosts of his ancestors? The studio was located in Piazzale Donatello, a short walk from the old English cemetery, where the streets bore the names of Renaissance artists and freedom fighters. I had chosen to wear black, a subtle nod to the academic life I had put on hold, a life that felt increasingly distant. The painter, an American expat, was about my age, and while his passion lay in plein-air landscapes, he earned his living by painting portraits of Florence's noble patrons, making them appear more noble than they were. The first few sessions were a mix of excitement and discomfort. Sitting still for hours, breathing in the fumes of linseed oil and turpentine, I found myself lost in thought. Who was I, really, in this moment? A professor, a historian, or something more? As I posed in my Prada outfit, I couldn't help but think of Virginie Gautreau, the eccentric widow from my native city who had become Madame X through John Singer Sargent's scandalous gaze. Was I becoming a version of her, a blank slate, a Professoressa X? The painter usually stopped around noon, and I would change out of my costume, the black dress that seemed to weigh more with each passing day. I'd take the long way home, wandering through the piazzas of Florence, each one a reminder of the city's rich history and the layers of life that had unfolded here over centuries. One afternoon, famished and in need of a break, I bought a panino from Rivoire and headed to the Loggia dei Lanzi. As I sat there, sharing the space with Cellini's Perseus, I watched the street theater unfold below African hustlers selling counterfeit goods, the constant dance of unfurling and vanishing that seemed to define this city. The architecture of Florence, with its grand buildings and narrow streets, turned the inauthentic into something almost real, a performance that blurred the lines between the past and the present. After lunch, I often stopped at the Enotka for a pick-me-up, a place where the locals gathered, and the air was thick with the scent of spumante and the sound of chatter. The bar was a microcosm of Florence, a place where the old and the new, the traditional and the avant-garde, coexisted in a delicate balance. But as I sat there, sipping my wine, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was a part of this story, a story that was still unfolding, a story that would one day be told. And so, as I prepared to return to the studio the next day, I couldn't help but wonder what the marchese wanted with a portrait of me. Was it a validation of himself, a way to add a new chapter to the story of his family? Or was it something more, a connection to a past that, like Bianca's, would never truly be forgotten? The attitudes towards suicide in the West have shifted dramatically over time. In ancient Greece and Rome, figures like Socrates and Lucretia were seen as heroes when they took their own lives. However, early Christians like St. Augustine began to view suicide as a grave sin. People who took their own lives were denied proper burials, and their property was often confiscated. This harsh stance continued through the Middle Ages, where suicide was often associated with demonic influence. By the late 18th century, however, society began to view suicide more sympathetically, often attributing it to mental or social distress rather than moral failing. Bianca, a mysterious figure associated with Palazzo Rucellai, seems to fall somewhere in this evolving narrative. There is no clear record of her suicide, no note left behind, no physical trace of her fall. The palace's walls have been whitewashed, and any signs of her presence have long since faded. Yet Bianca's story has become a part of the household lore, a convenient explanation for unexplained events and missing objects. But for some, she represents something deeper, a symbol of the long, quiet period in the palace's history, a time of settling and reflection. The house itself, with its rich history, is undeniably haunted, though not in the traditional sense. The word haunt originally meant to visit or use something frequently, making a haunted house a place of familiarity and comfort. Over time, this meaning shifted, and by the 16th century, a haunted house became a place of fear and unease. This duality is captured in Freud's concept of the uncanny, where something can be both familiar and unsettling. Bianca's fall from a window in Palazzo Rucellai is a tragic event, but her story is also a reflection of the palace's complex history. The building, with its unfinished facade and internal renovations, tells a tale of financial decline and adaptation. In the 17th century, the family added a coat of arms to the wall, marking their territory but also highlighting the unevenness of the facade. This visible scar, a reminder of their past, continued to influence the family's decisions for generations. The interior of the palace, as described by an 18th century archivist, is a mix of grandeur and decay. The original design by Leon Battista Alberti was only partially realized, with some parts left unfinished. Over the years, the family made various alterations, adding and removing mezzanines, walled-in spaces, and created a maze-like structure. The rooms on the second floor, once grand, were left uninhabitable, a stark contrast to the elegance of the lower floors. This physical transformation of the palace mirrors the emotional and psychological changes within the family. The once grand frescoes and furnishings were gradually replaced or removed, and the younger generations, like Bianca, found themselves living in a space that was both a reminder of their heritage and a burden. The weight of history, the pressure to live up to ancestors, and the struggle to find one's place in a changing world might have been too much for Bianca, leading to her tragic decision. The concept of memory and place is central to understanding Bianca's story. In ancient Greece, Aristotle described a method of memory called mnemotechnics, where information was stored in mental images of places. The Romans expanded this idea, using architectural spaces as a way to recall and organize information. This method, known as the memory palace, involved placing facts in different rooms of an imagined house, which could then be revisited to retrieve the information. In the early modern period, the invention of the printing press changed how stories were told and remembered. Texts now structured the spaces they described, making stories more than just narratives. To truly understand a work, one had to explore all its hidden rooms and secrets, not just its surface-level details. The Rucellai family archive, located in a small, windowless room on the second floor, is a repository of the family's history. This room, filled with dusty documents and family portraits, is a physical embodiment of the memory palace concept. The archive contains Giovanni Rucellai's Zibaldone, a commonplace book that holds the family's secrets and stories. This book, a thick volume bound in wood and leather, is a key to understanding the family's past and the world they lived in. Bianca's story, like the palace itself, is a tapestry of memory and place, a reflection of the complex and often painful process of remembering and forgetting. In 1457, Giovanni Rucellai, a wealthy Florentine merchant, began writing a memoir in San Gimignano, a small town where he and his family had fled to escape the plague ravaging Florence. The disease had forced many wealthy families to leave the city, and Rucellai, despite his distance, still felt the shadow of death looming over him. To combat this, he turned to writing, filling his days with detailed notes and impressions of his life. Giovanni's memoir, or Zibaldone, was not a traditional autobiography. Instead, it was a mix of practical advice, estate inventories, and even mundane details like what he ate for breakfast. This eclectic collection was a way for him to leave a lasting record of his life and legacy. Giovanni was on the cusp of becoming one of Florence's wealthiest men, and his youngest son was set to marry into the powerful Medici family. With this in mind, Giovanni began his Zibaldone with a celebratory tone, documenting the history of the Rucellai family. He traced the family's lineage back 2 centuries, spanning 13 generations and 197 names. However, his genealogy was selective, focusing primarily on male ancestors and omitting the names of women, except for the wives of his grandfather. This changed later in life, when Giovanni, now a widower and in financial trouble, added a second genealogy that included 117 women, mostly those who had married into the family. This shift highlighted the importance of marriage alliances in maintaining the family's status. Giovanni's Zibaldone was a blend of original content and borrowed material. He drew extensively from ancient and contemporary authors, often rewriting and paraphrasing their works to fit his narrative. This creative use of sources, along with the involvement of professional scribes, made the Zibaldone a complex and sometimes contradictory document. After Giovanni's death, the Zibaldone and the family archive were largely forgotten, with documents going missing and the family's history becoming increasingly obscure. In the 18th century, the archive resurfaced when a family member added a brief history of the Rucellai through the 16th century. However, the authenticity of some of these additions, including letters describing a trip to Jerusalem, was later questioned. The archive was moved to Prato in 1767 and eventually sold to an English collector, John Temple Leader, in the 19th century. It was only in 1923 that Giovanni's descendants managed to bring the Zibaldone back to Florence, where it was placed in the family palace. The Palazzo Rucellai itself underwent significant changes over the centuries. In the 18th century, Giulio Rucellai, a prominent minister, initiated extensive renovations, including the addition of a grand staircase and modern amenities. He also commissioned ornate ceiling frescoes to celebrate his marriage, featuring illusionistic paintings that seemed to dissolve the building's structure. These embellishments, while beautiful, also suggested a certain shallowness, masking the family's more troubled history. One such troubling incident involved a love triangle in 1668. A courtesan named Pisanella, known for her beauty and charm, had 2 noble clients, Giulio Rucellai and Count Giovan Francesco del Benino. Pisanella skillfully played both men against each other, accepting gifts and money from each while maintaining a facade of innocence. Despite the rumors and jealousy, the game continued until one day, Rucellai, in a fit of jealousy, threatened Pisanella. She responded with a dramatic outburst, which only made Rucellai more enamored and willing to give her more money. This incident, recorded by an 18th century antiquarian, revealed the darker side of the Rucellai family's history, a side they would have preferred to forget. The Rucellai family's legacy, captured in Giovanni's Zibaldone and the ornate decorations of their palace, is a complex tapestry of selective memory, self-glorification, and hidden truth. Despite their efforts to control their narrative, the archives and historical records continue to reveal the multifaceted nature of their past. The morning sun brought a brisk air to Florence. I stood at my usual spot across the street from Palazzo Rucellai, sipping a cappuccino and staring at the facade. The light was clear and bright, and the late winter sun cast a golden glow over the building. As I approached the portal, I paused to bask in the sunlight. For years I had admired the facade from a distance, but today, standing close, I noticed something peculiar. My eyes were drawn to a small square section of the facade. The perpendicular lines and large rectangular forms reminded me of a Mondrian painting. As I looked closer, I saw a series of symbols etched into the stone, a triangle, a beta, and more. I stepped back, and the symbols became clearer. AXPKSU864 and others. Was this a message? How could I have missed it? By noon, I was back at the Kunsthistorisches Institut, scaling a ladder to reach the monographs on Alberti. I pulled down a stack of dusty books and began to search. The glyphs were real over 50 different symbols, most appearing at least twice, some many more times. Barely noticeable to the naked eye, they were etched into the facade in no discernible pattern. Some looked like masons' marks, while others, like stars and crosses, seemed more mysterious. I wondered if Alberti, the master of cryptography, had embedded a secret message into the facade. His polyalphabetic cipher was so secure that it was used by the U.S. Navy during the Civil War. If he did leave a message, what did it say and who was it for? Was it for me? Later that day, I walked to Vodafone to fix the internet in Archivio. When I presented the lease, the clerk said, "I'll need a valid contract to proceed." He pointed out that the lease lacked a marca d'abballo, a tax stamp required by Italian law. Without it, the lease was invalid. I rushed back to the palazzo, calculating the cost in my head around 370 euros. Was my residency in jeopardy? Furious, I took the birdcage elevator to Archivio. The old lift, a 1928 relic, was notoriously unreliable. It jerked and dropped, and I felt the floor give way. I pushed the emergentia button, but it took nearly 90 minutes for Nico to free me. I emerged on the ground floor, shaken and desperate, only to find the Contessa waiting to collect the rent. "That Bianca," she tesked. Up to her old tricks, I see. I handed her the unregistered lease. "An oversight, obviously," she explained. "I'll call the agency tomorrow." My research continued, but the code on the facade remained a mystery. One evening, I met Francesco at the Enotka for dinner. The days were getting longer, and the city was warming up. I felt a growing unease, though not from Francesco. "Dimmi cara, what have you learned about your beloved Palazzo Rucellai?" he asked. "All there is to know, I think. I've read practically everything in print," I replied. "Brava. So who do you think did it?" "The facade, Alberti. Sure, Rossellino would have overseen the implementation, but he shot me a pitying look. No, cara, I mean the murder." My jaw dropped. "A murder." He whispered, "Unnobile," and added, 10 years ago January." He poured a generous glass of wine, and I took a deep sip, trying to process the information. I had to get home. Ghosts I'd been warned about, but a murder. As I rushed out, Francesco called after me, "Stai attento e insaluto." Pay attention, no one knows who did it. I hurried home, through the portone, and up the stairs to Archivio. I double-checked the lock and caught my breath. The palazzo, with its secrets and mysteries, was more than I had bargained for. The symbols on the facade, the unregistered lease, and now a murder. What else was hidden in the walls of this grand old building? The past, as they say, is a foreign country, where things are done differently, and so it was with the Rucellai family, and their once magnificent Palazzo Rucellai. Financial struggles, which had been a constant since Giovanni Rucellai's bankruptcy in 1474, finally forced the family to open their doors to strangers. In 1826, the Layard family, Henry, Marion, and their 4 children moved into the palazzo, taking up residence on the first floor. The sum they paid, a mere 100 louis d'or a year, seems absurdly small today, but it allowed the Rucellai to maintain a semblance of their former glory, albeit in a more modest form on the upper floors. Young Austin Henry Layard, who would grow up to become a renowned archaeologist, was captivated by the palazzo from the moment he saw it. The rooms, with their damask silk walls and old pictures in carved Florentine frames, left a lasting impression on the 9-year-old boy. Despite the family's reduced circumstances, the palazzo retained an air of grandeur. However, there was one room that remained off-limits, a chapel with a locked door that piqued Austin's curiosity. One day, while his parents were away, he and the family's French servant, Pachot, managed to unlock the door. Inside, they found the embalmed body of a lady, Camilla Rucellai, who had taken the veil and become a Dominican tertiary named Lucia. The sight terrified the young Austin, but it also left an indelible mark on his imagination. The Rucellai were not alone in their financial struggles. By the 1820s, many Florentine noble families were leasing their palaces to the growing Anglo-American community, who flocked to the city for its cultural riches and affordable rents. Nathaniel Hawthorne, writing in 1858, called Florence the paradise of cheapness, a sentiment echoed by Henry James, who visited the city multiple times over the next 4 decades, each visit bringing a new story and a new resident. The influx of visitors also brought a demand for art. The political uncertainty surrounding the unification of Italy in the 1860s led to a flood of late medieval and early Renaissance art onto the market. The Rucellai, like many other noble families, found themselves selling off their treasures to make ends meet. The Palazzo on Via della Vigna Nuova, once a symbol of the family's wealth and prestige, gradually lost its art and antiques. The Filipino Lippi altarpiece, which had hung over young Austen's bed, eventually found its way to the National Gallery, a testament to the changing fortunes of the Rucellai family. As the years passed, the Palazzo continued to adapt to the times. The once private residence became a place of stories and memories, a microcosm of the broader changes sweeping through Florence and Italy. The Rucellai, with their rich history and enduring legacy, had to navigate a new world, one where the past was both a burden and a source of pride. Despite the challenges, the Palazzo remained a place of beauty and intrigue, a testament to the resilience of a family and a city that had seen it all.